In this video, I'm going to show you how to write polyfills in JavaScript. I'm going to be showing you how to write the polyfills for 5 different functions in JavaScript. And they are going to be the forEach, map, filter, reduce, and reduceRight functions. The polyfills are extremely important because it helps us get the idea of how these functions are implemented. And creating polyfills allows us to create our own implementations of these functions, which allows us to know about the behind the scenes of how these functions are created. Now, while creating these polyfills, I'm going to help you understand the pattern behind creating each of these polyfills. So as you keep moving ahead, you will understand the pattern behind how these polyfills are created, and in the future, you will be able to create any polyfill that you want. So without any further ado, let's get started. So first of all, I'm going to be creating the polyfill for forEach. Now before we create the polyfill for forEach, let's try to understand how a forEach generally works. So consider I have this array over here, and I'm going to add the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now let's see how a general forEach is implemented. All we have to do is array.forEach, and then within this callback we get 3 values. They're nothing but, as you can see over here, the value, the index, and the array. So we will just write value, index, and array. And just to be sure, I'm just going to console log all those values so that you get a better idea of what's going on. Value, index, and array. So now if I go to my browser, you can see I get the value, index, and the array for each particular iteration. So in the first case, when we iterate, the value is 1, the index is 0, and the entire array is this. So the value is 1, 0, and the entire array is this one. And then it starts iterating so on for the rest of the values. So it's important to know that the forEach doesn't return us anything. If I hover over this, you can see performs the specified action for each element in an array, and it doesn't return anything. As you can see in the description, there's nowhere mentioned that the forEach returns us anything. So these are the 2 things we need to keep in mind, that the forEach uses these 3 values and it doesn't return us anything. So when we create our own forEach function, we need to make sure it works exactly like this. Alright, so let's see how do we do that. Now to create our own forEach function, we have to make use of prototypes. So what I mean by that is, I'm just going to write array.prototype.myForEach. Alright, and I'm going to assign this to a function. So what this prototype is doing is, whenever I write array.prototype and then I write anything over here, this myForEach or whatever name I give over here gets attached to this array as a property. So what happens is, this prototype attaches this property myForEach that I created just now to whatever we specified over here, and in this case we specified an array. So now after this, whichever array I have created, I can use this myForEach from that array. So basically what that means is, in the same way we are using array.forEach over here, because we added array.prototype.myForEach, later on I can go ahead and use array.myForEach directly. And that is what this prototype helps us do. This prototype actually hides this function within this array, and that allows us to use this myForEach function that we have over here in any of our array that we create. Now, if you want a proper in-depth explanation of how this prototype works and how it's doing all that, you can comment down in the video and I'll make a separate video explaining that properly. So now, just to show you that my forEach is now attached to this array, all I'm going to do is I'm going to console log array.prototype. And if I save this and go to my browser, you can see we get this array over here. And if I open this up, you can see my forEach is attached over here. So you can see other functions as well: concat, fill, filter, flat map, flat, and all that. So basically every array function that's there is attached to this prototype. So if we also attach our own function like this using array.prototype, we can later on use it in this fashion. We can just call arr.forEach or arr.myForEach and use our custom function. Now, as I said, if you want to know more in depth about how this is happening behind the scenes, you can tell me and I'll make a separate video on prototypes. Now let's go ahead and create the myForEach function. So now, to understand the pattern of how to create these polyfills, it's always better to start by writing how we are going to use that custom function that we create. So what I mean by that is, over here, as we are using array.forEach and we are making use of this function and accessing all its values, it's important that I also do the same for my forEach function so that we get an idea of what we need to call and pass. Alright, so I'm just going to comment this out over here. and then over here I'm going to write array.myForEach. Of course, now this function doesn't do anything as this is empty over here, but this will just give us a brief idea of how we are going to use our myForEach function. In the end, once our myForEach function is made, we know that when we call it, we will be passing 3 values to it, which is going to be nothing but value, index, and the array itself. And the array over here is this one. Alright, so we'll just call this array, and then this calls the function, and then over here we just console log the values, right? Value, index, and array. Alright, so this is how it should work in the end. So now how do we make changes in this myForEach function over here so that when we call it, everything performs fine? So first of all, what we have to do is within the myForEach over here, you can see over here that when we access array.myForEach, we are passing this callback. So what we can do is over here, we can just write callback, because this callback over here is being passed to the myForEach function in the arguments, right? Over here, myForEach, within the argument, we have this callback. So that means since this myForEach is equal to a function, within this argument, we can write callback. This polyfill for myForEach is pretty simple. All we have to do is, we know that forEach doesn't return anything. It only iterates through each of the array. So for that, all we need to do is we just need to use for, and then within this, I'm going to do something like let index equals to 0, and then index should be less than the array.length, because we need to traverse in this array, right? So we need to traverse until the index is less than the array.length. But how do we get the array over here? How do we access this array that we are providing over here? Because if we want to iterate through that array, we need to be able to access this array over here. And to do that, as you can see here, I am calling array.myForEach over here. Now since this myForEach is attached to this array, if I use this over here, that this is going to refer to whatever myForEach is attached to. So if I use this dot length, this over here is going to refer to this array, since myForEach is attached to this array. Please make sure that you know what this means and what it does. If you don't, then I'll attach a link in the description and you can check out the video I made on this keyword. And then all I'm going to say is index plus plus. And then in the end, within this for loop, all I'm going to say is I'm going to call my callback, and within the parenthesis, I'm going to pass these 3 arguments, right? So what is the value going to be? So when I iterate through the array using the for loop, the value is going to be nothing but this of index, because we know that this is the array that we are referring to, and index is starting from 0 and it's going to go on till it's less than the array.length. So this of index is obviously going to be the value, the index is obviously going to be the index that we have over here, and lastly the array is going to be nothing but this. Alright, so I'm just going to save this, and now this should just work fine. We are calling array.myForEach, the function we just created over here, and we're console logging the values over here in the same way we had done for the normal forEach function which was present. So now let's see in the browser if it outputs us the same output that it did for this. So if I save this and I go to my browser, there you go. You can see it works perfectly fine in the same way as it was doing for the normal forEach as well. I'm going to refresh this and you can see it still works fine. Here, this one's the first value of the array, which is 1, this is the index 0, and this is the entire array. The same goes for the next elements 2, 3, 4, and 5 with their indexes printed and the array values. Alright, so this was all for the myForEach polyfill. Pretty simple, right? Now we are going to use this exact same pattern to create the polyfills for the other functions as well. Alright, so now let's move on to the polyfill for map. And you're going to see how similar these patterns are and how easy it is to make these polyfills. Now for map, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep this myForEach function as it is, and I'm going to make a few changes, and you're going to understand how similar they are. So what I'm going to do is I'm firstly going to remove this array.forEach comment that I have over here. I'm going to change this to something like map, and this to map as well. And I'm going to keep this array same over here. Now I'm going to change this function name, the custom function name, to my map. All right, and this should also be my map. Now before we go ahead and implement my map properly, let's just see what map gives us. Let's just see how map works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say array.map, and within this map you can see that the map also requires 3 arguments. First is the value, second is the index, and the third is the entire array, which is similar to the forEach function, and we already have that over here. Alright, so the map also takes the value, index, and the entire array. And if I go ahead and I implement this, now before I go ahead and do that, there's just one thing that map does differently compared to forEach. So if I hover on this, you can see, if I scroll down, you can see over here that the map calls a defined callback function on each element of an array and returns an array that contains the result. So the only difference between the forEach and the map is the map returns an array. The forEach doesn't return anything, and that's why we didn't have anything returned over here. So whatever operation we do inside the array.map, it returns us an array with all that results. So now just to see how that happens, what I'm going to do is inside this map function, I'm going to return value multiplied by 2. Alright, and then I'm just going to store this entire result within another variable. Let's call it new array, and I'm just going to console.log new array. Remember, now we haven't implemented my map, we are just testing how the normal map works, and then once we get how it works, we can go ahead and implement our own my map function. Now I'll just comment this out so that you guys don't get confused for now. Now if I save this and I go to my browser, then you will see that each of these values will be multiplied by 2 and they will be inside this new array. So if I go to my browser, you can see that the map is returning another array within which there is multiplied values of 2 for each elements of the array. So whatever operation we perform in the map after it performs that operation, it adds all those elements into an array. So that's what it means when in the definition of map it says that the map returns an array. But the forEach doesn't do this. The forEach just iterates through the array element that we provide as an argument in the callback. It doesn't return an array like it's doing over here. So now remember the pattern I told you to focus on. Before we implement the map, we have to first of all write how we are going to use that map. And this is exactly how we are going to use it, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to comment this out. I'm going to remove this, going to comment this out as well for now, and I'm going to uncomment everything we had done for the my forEach function. And as you remember, I had replaced the my forEach with my map. This is going to be our own my map custom function. Alright, now remember how I wrote new array equals to array.map, because map pushes all those elements after performing its operation into a new array. So if I assign a new array variable to that returned array, this new array contains all that elements of the array. So map is being used almost exactly like forEach. The only different thing was we were assigning a variable to it because map returns a value. So over here we'll do the same thing. We will do let new array equals to array.mymap and so on. And in the forEach I had explained that it takes value, index, and array, and the same thing is done by the map. Map also takes these three values, and over here we had performed this operation, right? So we will do the same over here. We will just perform this operation. We can also console log, but just to get to see the difference better, we will return a value multiplied by 2. So this is how we are going to use our my map, similar to how we were using the normal map. Alright, so now let's implement this. The implementation is going to be the same. This for loop is going to be there as it is. The only difference is it returns an array. So what we can do is we can define over here let returned array equals to an empty array, and then within this function over here, all we have to do is something like this. I'm first of all just going to comment this out, and over here I'm going to write returned array dot push. Alright, so every element that we iterate through is pushed into this array and then it's returned in the end. So one thing to remember is after this for loop is done executing everything that's going on within it, we need to make sure that we return this returned array, right? So we created an empty array and in the end we are returning the returned array. Alright, so what do we have to do in here so that each of those values are pushed within this returned array? All we have to do for that is, remember this callback function I had commented out. I'm going to copy this, I'm going to remove this commented portion out, and within this push I'm going to paste that callback function. Now this is literally all you have to do to replicate the map function. So what's happening over here? Let's try run this once. So when I'm looping through each of these elements, so suppose when I reached 1, so what happens here is we do returned array dot push and we are calling this callback. Now this callback calls this function over here. because the my map takes an argument which is this callback, and this callback is passed over here, which we are calling it right over here. Right, so when we do return array.push, currently it's empty. When we do our first push, we are passing the result of whatever this callback returns. So what that means is, now when this callback is called with all these arguments present within it, what happens is this callback gets invoked, it goes within this function, and over here it sees the operation being performed is value multiplied by 2. So when we call this callback, it calls this callback, and then for that particular index, which is for that particular value of the array which we are iterating through, which is 1 in this case, it performs this operation. So it becomes 1 into 2, which is 2, and then that is returned. So this part is replaced with that 2, and then it is pushed into the return array. Alright, that's pretty simple, right? Just basic JavaScript. Within the return array, we push whatever the result of the callback is. And this callback coming from here is nothing but this argument that's present over here. So when we call this callback, when we invoke this function, this gets called, and within it this operation gets performed, and then for that particular element of the array, that value multiplied by 2 is returned, which is the result of this callback, and then that result gets pushed into this returned array. Alright, so then it goes on and happens for each of the elements of the array. It keeps on pushing into the returned array for each of these elements, and once all that is done, in the end we just return the returned array. Alright, it's as simple as that. So the only difference compared to forEach was we just had to create the returned array, and within the returned array we are pushing the values from the callback, and we are returning the returned array. Now all I'm going to do is I'm just going to go down here and I'm going to uncomment this console log. So we are going to console log the new array which has come from iterating through the my-map function which we created. So now if I save my file, then when I go to the browser, you're going to see that it returns the same value as this normal.map function had returned. It's going to return the updated values where each of these elements will be multiplied by 2. So now let's save this file and go on to our browser. And over here you can see it returns the values multiplied by 2 for each element, similar to how it was doing for the .map function. So this proves that our my-map polyfill also works fine. Pretty easy, right? Alright, so now let's move on to the filter polyfill. Now the filter polyfill is almost very similar to the my-map polyfill. So just to see how that works, let's go ahead and first do the same that we did for forEach and map. Let's first see how filter works, and after that let's implement that as well. So I'm just going to remove this comment over here, and then I'm going to change this to polyfill for filter. Let's just remove these spacings, then filter over here as well. We're going to keep the same array. We are going to name this my filter, and then over here I'm going to say my filter as well, and then we are going to console log this, and then now we can just go ahead and check how filter works first. So for now I'm just going to comment this out, alright, like we did previously for my map, and over here we are going to implement filter function for this array. So how is that implemented? We can write array.filter, going to give the parenthesis, and you can see the filter also takes the value, index, and the array itself. So similar to map and forEach, value, index, and array. And then let's see if filter returns us something. I'll just hover on this. You can see returns the elements of an array that meet the condition specified in a callback function. So what filter does is, based on the condition that we provide within this filter callback, the filter checks for that condition for each value of the array, and for the elements which are satisfying that condition, it returns all those elements in an array. So what I'm going to do is, for each of these elements in an array, when we filter through it, I'm going to write a condition that if value is greater than 2, then return the value. Alright, and I'm just going to keep this within this new array variable. I'm going to save it. So now what should happen is, all the values greater than 2 should be returned into a new array, and then when we console that new array over here, it should show us 3, 4, and 5. If I go to my browser, you can see we get this array within which there's 3, 4, and 5. So this means filter also returns an array, and it returns all those elements which specify the condition that has been passed within this callback. So now let's go ahead and try to implement this. I'm just going to comment this out, and I'm going to uncomment all of this that we had done for the my map. Of course, we had replaced this with my filter instead of my map. So as I said first, before we implement the polyfill and the function within it, we first need to write down how we are going to call that my filter polyfill in the end. And that's going to be obviously similar to how we have called the filter over here. Now, why I do this first, why I write the way we need to call the function first, is because it gives us an idea of the pattern that we need to follow and how the execution will work moving forward. So all we had done over here is we had written if value greater than 2, return value. So I'm going to do the same thing. It's going to write if value greater than 2, it's going to return the value. I'm going to copy this, place it here, and I'm going to remove the multiplied by 2. So this is obviously same as this, but we are calling it with our my filter. And now my filter hasn't been created, so this won't work. But after we are done updating the contents within this function, this my filter, which is being called exactly as this dot filter, should end up working. And if it does, then it means our polyfill is working fine. So this is all we had done for the map function. So what exactly is different for the filter? We know that filter also returns an array, just like the map, so we don't have to change any of this. The only thing that's different is when we iterate through each of these elements, we need to check based on a condition, right? The condition that we are providing here, we need to write up something so that when we iterate through the elements of the array, our polyfill checks for a specific condition, and based on that, only those arrays which satisfy the condition are returned. So since we return an array in filter as well, this is going to remain the same. This is also going to remain the same because we are ultimately mapping through the array, right? We are ultimately going through each element of the array no matter what, right? So this is going to be the same, and this part is also going to remain the same because within the returned array, we are ultimately going to push the elements which satisfy the condition. So the only thing that's going to change is this over here. Within this for loop, all I'm going to write is I'm going to write a if condition. And I'm going to say, I'm going to first of all copy this callback. I'm going to paste this over here, and I'm going to say if this callback is not equal to undefined, then and only then we want to push into the returned array all those elements. So what does this exactly mean? This is pretty simple. All we are doing is we are first calling this function callback within this if statement, right? So for example, we iterate through this array, we go to the first element, it checks for this if statement. Now in the if statement, it will call this callback function. So when we call this callback function, it obviously calls the callback which was passed here, which means it is calling this callback, right? It means it's calling this callback over here. So within this if statement, when this callback is called, we are going to see if the value returns anything or not. So when this callback is invoked, the contents within this function is executed. So what happens is the value currently is 1, right, for the first element of the array. So since this callback has this of index, this gets mapped to this value, of course, which is 1 in this case. Now value is not now 1 is not greater than 2, so it will not return a value. So what will it do? If it doesn't return a value, what does it return? It returns an undefined. So for the first element, when this callback is invoked, it is invoked for the value of 1, and 1 is not greater than 2, so it does not return anything. So therefore it returns an undefined. And when undefined is returned, we are not going within this, because we have mentioned over here, if the callback, if the returned value from the callback, if the result that comes out after invoking this callback function, if that is not equal to undefined, right, if that is not equal to undefined, only then push those elements in the array. But for 1 is not greater than 2, so it's not going to return 1, it's not going to return the value, it's going to return nothing. So it will not go within the content of this if statement. Then what's going to happen? This is going to end over here after line number 12, and then the for loop is going to do index plus plus, and then we are going to go to the second element of the array, which is 2. Now for 2, again this callback will be called. Now this of index will be 2 obviously, and this value is 2. This will be invoked again, and 2 is not greater than 2, so we will again get undefined returned. Right, so the returned value will again be undefined because we are not going within this, so we'll get nothing. So once undefined is returned again, this callback will be equal to undefined, but we are checking for not equal to undefined, so this condition won't work again, and then we will simply exit out of this if statement and index plus plus will occur, and then we'll go to this element whose value is 3 now. Now for the third value, this is going to work because when index is equal to 2 after the index plus plus, this if statement will run again, this callback will be called, and when this callback gets called for the this of index, which is this of 2, which is nothing but this of 2 is 3, so when callback is called with those values, this will be called again, and then in this case value, which is the this of index, is nothing but 3, so value is equal to 3, so 3 is greater than 2, and when 3 is greater than 2, it's going to go within this if statement and it's going to return the value, which is 3. So now for the second index, basically for the value of 3 and the index of 2, this callback over here, which called this function, returned something finally. This callback over here finally returned something because this condition got satisfied. Since 3 is greater than 2, it returned a value, which is 3 in this case. So this time callback, whatever the value it returns, which is 3 in this case, so this entire part will be replaced with nothing but 3. So 3 is not equal to undefined, which means this if statement is satisfied. And once that happens, all we're going to do is return array.push, and we're going to push the result of this callback, which was nothing but 3, right? So within this return array, 3 is going to be pushed, and then for the next elements of the array, which is 4 and 5, this callback is going to be invoked again, and this condition is going to be satisfied, so a value is going to be returned, so it is not going to be equal to undefined. So therefore return array is also going to push 4 and 5 respectively, and ultimately when we return this returned array, it is going to have the values of 3, 4 and 5. So this my filter over here will ultimately return this returned array, which we are storing within this new array variable, and which we, if we console log, should give us the output of 3, 4 and 5. So now if I save this, and as you remembered in the normal filter function, I had invoked it exactly like this. You can see these two are same. And for the filter, it had worked. It had shown me 3, 4 and 5. Now let's see if 3, 4 and 5 is also visible, is also outputted for our my filter function. I'm going to save this. I'm going to go to my browser, and there you go. You can see if I even refresh the page, you can see it outputs 3, 4 and 5. So this means our filter function also works perfectly fine. And you can see how similar this was to the myMap function that we had created. All we had to do is just follow the pattern, and that's the reason why I implemented this first, why I implemented the way we use the filter function first. Because in the filter function, the only difference is we use a condition, and if that condition is successful, then something is returned, right? So all we have to do in the myFilter function is also we have to check for the condition. If the condition is not equal to undefined, which means the condition is true, that means some value is being returned. So only then we push all the elements into the array, because the filter also returns an array, same as the map. So the only difference was adding that specific condition. So I hope now you're getting the pattern of how to build polyfills. First we write how that function actually works, then we are going to create our own function, name it whatever we want, and we are going to call it in the same way how it actually works. And then based on that, within our array.prototype.myFilter, and within that function, we are going to implement based on whatever values we need to send, and how when the callback gets invoked, it performs the operation accordingly. So now I hope you're getting the idea of how polyfills are made, about why I'm first creating the normal filter function, and then I'm doing the same for the myFilter function, for the function that I create, and why I execute it in the same way as the original function is executed, so that I can get an idea of how my filter function should also work. And then after that, we go ahead within the custom function that we create and start adding all the elements to make it work with our myFilter function. It's pretty simple, right? You just need to read about what that particular function does. For example, it returns an array, so we initiate an array and we return it, and then in filter also it goes through each element of that array and it checks based on that condition. So we iterate through each of the elements in the array, and we specify a condition, and if that condition turns true, then we push into the array that we had declared over here, and then we return that entire thing. So that's all for filter. So now let's go ahead and implement the fourth polyfill, which is reduce. So first of all, I'm just going to remove this comment, and then I'm going to rename this to polyfill for reduce. This will be reduce, and we're going to do it for the same array over here. And over here I'm going to rename it to my reduce, and this will also become my reduce, and we're just going to console log over here. And now, as we did it for the other polyfills, first of all I'm just going to comment this out, and then we are going to go right underneath this and we are going to see how reduce works. All right, so now I'm going to implement the reduce function. So reduce, let's see what reduce expects. So reduce is a little different compared to the other polyfills, but it's also pretty much similar. First of all, reduce takes this previous value and this current value and the current index. So let's just write previous value, current val, and current index. All right, so we are first going to try and implement reduce to understand how it works behind the scenes. So what does reduce actually do? So if we hover on reduce, we can read about it over here. It calls a specific callback function for all elements in the array. So that callback is called for every element in the array. The return value of the callback function is the accumulated result and is provided as an argument in the next call to the callback function. So what reduce does is, whatever operation I perform within this function that we have over here, reduce is going to perform that operation for each elements of the array, and whatever result that comes from each operation is going to be stored in the previous value. And when we go to the next value in the array, that current value is going to refer to the current element we are in the array, and the previous value is going to be the result of the previous operation that we had done. So what this means is, if I just return here previous value plus current value, then what this does is it's just going to add up all the elements of the array. So before we go ahead, it's important to know that reduce accepts two arguments. So the first argument is the callback that we have over here, and the second argument is nothing but an initial value. Now in this case, I'm going to initiate the initial value as nothing but 0. And as you can see, if I hover, it shows that the first argument is the callback function, and the second one is the initial value, which is nothing but a number. So what does this mean? I'm going to save this. What does this mean basically? So that you can view this properly, I'm just going to bring it down here. I'm going to zoom out a bit, and yeah. So what does this mean actually? This means that if the initial value over here is 0, so when we start iterating through the array, when we use array.reduce, this also iterates through each element of the array and it performs the function, right? That whatever operation we have specified over here. So when we start iterating through the array, this is going to be the first value, right? Now for this first value, there is no previous value because this is the first value we're iterating through the array. So that's what this initial value does. When we pass a value over here, this value gets assigned to the previous value. So when we start iterating through the array, the previous value has the value of 0, whatever that we pass over here. And if we decide to pass nothing over here, if we just decide to pass the callback, then the previous value is automatically going to take the value of 0. All right. So if I pass 0 over here, this is going to be nothing but previous value is going to be 0. So for the first element of the array, the current value is going to be 1, which is the first element. So this previous value will be 0, 0 plus current value 1 will give us 1. Right? So this is the accumulated result of the first element when we are iterating through the first element. So now what this means is this previous value plus current value, which gives us 0 plus 1, which is 1. When reduce goes on to the next element of the array, this previous value is set to 1 already due to the previous operation. In the previous operation, it was 0 plus 1, 1. So the previous value, when we go on to the second element of the array, has the value of 1. So when it goes to 2, the previous value will be 1 and the current value will become 2 because we are at the value of 2, which is the index 1. So it's going to do 1 plus 2, which is going to give us 3. Then when we go on over here, the current value is going to be 3 and the previous value is also 3 because 1 plus 2 was 3. Then it's going to give us 3 plus 3, which is 6, and so on. It's going to go ahead, loop through the entire array, add up all the elements based on the previous value and current value, and then it's going to give us an accumulated result of all these elements. So the final result is going to be an accumulation of all these elements together. So just to show you the output, as it's mentioned in the reduce description over here, it returns a value, right? It returns a value. So what we have to do is I'm going to write const new array equals to array.reduce, and we are console logging this over here. So it should give us the addition of all those elements. If I go to my browser You can see it gives me 15. Now, just to show you that if I change this 0 to 5, then the initial value itself is going to be 5. So what this means is the previous value for the first element is going to be 5. So since the current value for the first element is going to be 1, the previous value is going to be 5. So what it's going to do is that it's going to add up everything, but it's also going to add a total of 5 to that following sum, to that accumulated sum, because we initiated with a value of 5. So if we initiate this by 5, the result which we should get will be not 15 but 20 this time. If I save and I go to my browser, you can see the result is 20. So that's what this initial value does. And as you can see, if I don't pass anything and if I save it, then the value is 15. So it just assumes that the initial value will be 0 if we don't pass anything. Just add the initial value back again, make it 0. So I hope you understood what reduce does now. It's important that we get to know what this function does, right, before we start implementing that for a particular function itself, because there's no point implementing something that we don't know about, that without even knowing how it works, there's no point implementing that. So now that we have got a clearer idea of how reduce works, let's go ahead and write its polyfill. So now we are going to follow the same steps as I did for all the other polyfills. I'm going to comment this out and I'm going to uncomment all of this back, and I'm going to implement this same function but for my reduce function. So what this does this time is it takes previous value, current index. So what that means is I can basically just copy everything that I did within this function right over here. Instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy these three. All right over here. I'm going to remove this over here. I'm going to copy those three previous value, current value and current index, and then I'm just going to add the addition of that over here. And then this is the callback, and after the callback we can also pass the next argument, which is 0, which is the initial value. So this is exactly the same as this, just that we have written it for our myReduce function. So this is how ultimately we are going to implement it. We are going to call our myReduce function, and these are the parameters it's gonna take. So it takes two arguments, 0, which is the initial value, and a callback, right? So now in the myReduce function that we're going to create, we are going to keep most of the things same that we did for filter and map, but there are going to be a few changes. For example, in map, filter, forEach, they all used to take one callback, but here there are two arguments. One is the callback and the other one is the initial value. So what we can do here is we can pass after the callback, we can write something called initial value, and we can initiate this as null. All right, because if we don't pass anything over here, then it still assumes the value to be 0, right? The previous value to be 0. So we can initiate this with null, and you're going to get clearer with this as we move ahead. So as you remember, when I was doing this reduce, and what it does is it adds up all this element and it provides us with the accumulated result, right? With the accumulated result from each of these elements. So the important thing to remember is when we console logged this, it gave us the value 15 or 20 based on whatever we passed over here. So it did not return us an array, it returned us a value, right? So this time we do not need this array over here, right? What we can do is we can write let accumulator, and we can initiate it with the initial value, and we are returning the accumulated result in the end. So whatever this accumulated value is in the end, we are going to return it within this myReduce polyfill. Alright, so this is pretty simple. This part that I said, this accumulator is going to be initiated with the initial value. So that's why I have put null over here as well, because if we do not pass anything, then this initial value is going to be null, and this accumulator is going to assume it to be 0 by default. So that's why I've also added this initial value as null, because if we do not send anything over here in the second argument, then this initial value is automatically by default going to be null, which is going to initiate the accumulator with the null value. Alright, and then if the accumulator is null in the beginning, then it's just going to run the for loop for each of these elements, and it's going to take each of these values one by one, and that accumulator will not start from some other value because we have set this to null. But if we do provide any value over here, suppose 5 or 10, then this initial value is going to have 5 or 10, whatever we provide, and this accumulator is going to begin with that initial value of 5 or 10 based on whatever we provide to it. So you must know that in JavaScript, if we are actually passing something as the second argument over here, then this null gets overridden with that value that we passed in the argument. So even though it seems like whatever we pass over here will just end up being null in the end, that's not the case. If we actually end up passing something here, then this null will be overridden with that value that we pass, and the accumulator will begin from that value. Now within the for loop, it's going to be really simple. All I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this callback. This callback is always essential because this callback calls this callback, right, within the reduce that we have. It did the same for the map, for each, filter, and so on. All this callback does in each of those polyfill is that it passes all these values after taking reference from it, and within the reduce or the my map or the my filter, the operation is just performed. So over here, the base idea is this accumulator needs to be the result of whatever this operation provides. So now within this for loop, all we need to do is, first of all, I'll just copy this callback that you see over here. I'm going to remove this if statement that we have over here, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to write accumulator is equal to, I'm going to paste that callback, and in this callback I'm going to make a few changes. So as you can see over here in the my reduce, the first argument, which is the callback, it takes these arguments. Actually, if I just uncomment this quickly and I hover on this reduce, you will also notice that the reduce also takes array as the last argument. So you can just pass over here the array as well. So this is just to let you know that reduce also takes the array as the last argument. Obviously we are not using it here, but the reduce does take that. So we also need to make sure our polyfill does the same. So keeping that in mind, I'm also going to add array over here in our my reduce, since this always has to be the same as this, because here we are just creating how we are going to call that reduce function, which is obviously same as this but with our own function name. So back to where we were, the callback over here, it accepts 4 arguments, right? Previous value, current index, and array. So let's pass each of them. Previous value is going to be nothing but the accumulator, right? Because the accumulator is going to hold the initial value, and over here the accumulator is going to be updated after each iteration. So for the next iteration, the previous value for that particular element will obviously be whatever we have in the accumulator. So the previous value will be the accumulator. The current value is obviously this of index. This is the array we are referencing to. In this case, array.arr.myReduce has been called. So this refers to this array, which is nothing but 1 2 3 4 5. So current value is this of index. Current index is obviously just the index that we can pass over here, and the array is nothing but this. This is all similar to how we did it for the other polyfills, except we are just passing this accumulator as an extra argument. You can see all of these polyfills are pretty similar. They just have 1 or 2 things different, and we just have to understand what part of it is different and modify it within our function. And to understand what exactly is different is the reason why I first implement that function on its own. Because as you saw, when I implemented this, it gave me an idea that previous value is something that we are passing differently over here. So that is nothing but the accumulator, because the accumulator is initiated with the initial value in the beginning. So now with that, I'm going to save this. And now this is all that we have to do for the myReduce polyfill. Pretty simple, right? But just to help you understand, I'm just going to dry run through the code once. So over here, when we iterate through the for loop, the index is 0, and we are in this element of the array, which is the first element, having the value of 1. So the accumulator, when we first call it, whatever we pass over here, let's consider we have passed 0 over here. So the initial value is going to be 0. The accumulator will have 0 in it. All right. Then when we loop through for the first element of the array, the accumulator is going to be equal to whatever the callback returns us. So when this callback is called, the accumulator currently is 0. Right? It's because this argument passes over here to the initial value, and the accumulator is initially 0. So this part is 0. This is the this of index, which means the array of 0, which is 1. So this is 0. This part is 1. This part is also 0 because we are at the 0th index, and this is going to be the array. So previous value is the accumulator, which is initially 0 for the first element of the array, right? Because we have passed this as the initial value. So when we do this operation, previous value is the accumulator, which for the first element is 0. So previous value is 0 plus the current value. And the current value is nothing but this of index, which is 1 in this case for the first element. 0 plus 1 gives us 1, and that 1 is returned by this callback. So whatever operation we do after the arrow means that we are returning that value. If we had written parenthesis, then we would have to specify return and then added previous value plus current value. But if we directly write arrow and then the operation after that, then it directly returns that value. So when that's done, when 0 plus 1 is returned, which is nothing but 1, this accumulator holds the value of 1 for the first iteration of the array. So now when we go to the second loop, we are obviously not going to start from here because we are already in the for loop. So this accumulator holds the value of 1. This callback is called again. The accumulator this time is 1. This of index this time is 2 because the index is 1 this time, because for the second iteration index plus plus was done. So index is nothing but 1. So this of index is nothing but this of 1, which is 2. So accumulator was 1. This part is 2, index also gets passed as 2, and the entire array. So when this callback is called with those values again, previous value, which is the accumulator, was 1 from the previous iteration. 1 plus current value, which is 2, becomes 3. Then it is returned from this callback, and then this accumulator takes the value of 3. So till the second iteration, the accumulator has a value of 3, which makes sense. 2 plus 1 is 3 for the initial value of 0, right? And then it goes on so on for the rest of the elements. It adds up all the values, stores in the accumulator as the previous value, and in the end, once the for loop is over, we return the accumulated result, all right, which in this case is 15. So now if I save this myReduce function, this myReduce polyfill that we created should return us 15, as it had returned over here for the normal reduce function. Now if this works, that means whatever we did works completely fine, and we just created the myReduce function. So I'm just going to save this and check in my browser, and there you go. I'm going to refresh this as well, and you can see it shows 15. So that means our polyfill for reduce works. And just to be sure, I'm going to change this initial value to 5, and upon doing that, it should give me a value of 20 this time, similar to how it had given for the normal reduce function as well. If I save this and I go to my browser, there you go, you see we get the value of 20. So this proves that the myReduce function that we created works exactly like the reduce function that already exists. So this is literally all we have to do in order to create the reduce polyfill. Now moving on, lastly, let's just create the reduceRight polyfill. Now reduceRight polyfill is like 99% similar to the normal reduce. All that reduceRight does is, instead of iterating from the start of the array till the end, it iterates from the end of the array to the start. So just to quickly show you what it does, I'm just going to comment this out. I'm just going to write over here reduceRight polyfill for reduceRight, just in caps lock, reduceRight, and then I'm just going to uncomment this, and over here I'm going to write reduceRight, and I'm going to keep the same. But obviously if I add the same elements, in this case it's going to give me the same value, because even if we add from the end till the first, it's obviously going to give us the value of 15 again. Just to show you that it actually iterates from the end, what I'm going to do is, so that we can see the difference, all I'm going to do is I'm going to console log the current value. All right, so if I console log the current value as I have done here, then it's going to print me 5 4 3 2 1 instead of 1 2 3 4 5, which it would have done in the normal reduce function. So if I save this and I go to my browser, there you go, you can see we get 5 4 3 2 and 1. So when we create our reduceRight polyfill, all I'm going to do within it is just console.log to prove you that we did actually create the reduceRight polyfill properly. And if I just remove this console once and I keep that previous value plus current value, and if I save this and I go to my browser, you can see that it returns the value of 15, and you know this time that it's iterating from the last to the first. But even in that case, obviously it will return the same value. Just to show you the same by implementing our own polyfill, all we have to do, literally all we have to do is this. I'll just uncomment this, and you can guess this by yourself too. We just have to reverse this loop. For that, all I need to do is I can write this dot length -1. That's where our index is going to start from, until I'll remove this index less than this dot length, because this time we have to go until our index is greater than equal to 0, and since we are going from the last to the first, we have to do index -. Alright, so we just reverse the iteration of the array from start to last to the beginning. So now index is starting from this start length -1 and it goes on till the first index. So now if I save this, and over here we have our my reduce polyfill, if I just save this and I run it in the browser, you can see it gives us the same output, which is 20. Since we're passing 5 as the initial value, we just make this 0 and I save it, you can see it gives us 15. And just to be completely sure, I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to add those curly braces and I'm going to console log the current value, and now it should show those values, the current values, in the reverse order from the last to the first. If I go to my console, there you go, you can see 5 4 3 2 1. So now this proves, and of course we also need to change this name over here to my reduceRight. Sorry, I didn't do that first, but yeah, you get the idea. So now if I go and check again, you can see it comes out in the reverse order. So now it proves us entirely that this my reduceRight works exactly like the reduceRight that we have over here. So we just got done with creating forEach, map, filter, reduce and reduceRight polyfills, and for each of them I showed you the exact pattern of how to make them, of how we should initially first check how that particular function works, then we should call that function exactly how we do normally but with our own custom function name, and then we should see the parameters or the arguments that the function takes, the callback value takes, and then based on that, when we create our polyfill, we should pass a callback and pass all those values within that callback accordingly by comparing it to how we call that particular function. So I hope you understood the pattern behind creating polyfills, and in the future I'm also going to create more polyfills such as polyfill of find, promise.all, and so on. So if you really enjoyed this video and got to learn a lot, then please don't forget to like and subscribe this video, as I'm going to upload more such similar videos trying to go deep into JavaScript itself. So if you're interested, don't forget to like and subscribe and stay tuned for more.